he lost his wife. Now, he needed someone to help take care of his son. He hired a maid, but from the first day he saw her, he wanted her for himself. Hello and welcome to Love in Chapters, where we share beautiful, romantic, and heartwarming love stories. So hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our beautiful stories. Also, please drop a comment in the comments section letting us know what time and part of the world you are listening to today's story. Your comments keeps me going and helps spread out stories across the globe. My prayer is that love never depart our lives and the peace that comes with love fill our hearts. Amen. Now, let's begin. The autumn light filtered through the study's tall windows as Daniel Trent sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing the resume before him for the third time. His fingers drummed absently against the polished wood, a habit he'd developed in the lonely months since Emily's passing. The clock struck 10, and a gentle knock echoed through the room. "Come in," he called, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd learned to maintain. Grace Thompson entered, and Daniel's first impression was of warmth. Despite her visible nervousness, fingers clutching her worn leather portfolio a bit too tightly, the slight tremor in her step, her smile reached her eyes in a way that momentarily caught him off guard. She wore a simple blue dress, professional yet unpretentious, and her dark hair was neatly pulled back, revealing features that spoke of both kindness and determination. "Mr. Trent," she greeted him, her voice steady despite her obvious anxiety. "Thank you for considering my application." Daniel gestured to the chair across from him, studying her as she sat. There was something genuine about her demeanor that stood out from the other candidates he'd interviewed. Where they had been polished and practiced, Grace seemed real. "Your culinary background is impressive," he began, "though your recent experience seems limited to smaller establishments." Grace's smile didn't waver. "Sometimes the smallest kitchens hold the biggest hearts, Mr. Trent. I believe food is about more than sustenance. It's about creating moments, memories." Something in her words struck a chord. Daniel remembered Emily in their kitchen, flour on her cheek, laughing as she attempted to teach him to make her grandmother's apple pie. He pushed the memory aside, focusing on the present. "This position involves more than cooking, Miss Thompson. My son, Oliver." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "He's had a difficult year." Grace's expression softened with understanding. "Children often speak through silence, Mr. Trent. Sometimes they just need someone to listen in the right way." Her response wasn't rehearsed. It carried the weight of personal experience. Daniel found himself nodding, and before he fully realized it, he was offering her the position. The transformation began with dinner that first evening. Daniel arrived home to unfamiliar aromas wafting through the house, warm, inviting scents that reminded him of comfort and home. Following the sounds of movement, he found himself at the kitchen entrance, frozen in place by the sight before him. Oliver sat at the counter, watching intently as Grace prepared what appeared to be chicken pot pie. She was explaining each step, her movements fluid and natural, and then it happened. Oliver smiled. It wasn't the polite, empty smile he'd worn for months, but a genuine expression of interest and joy. Daniel felt his throat tighten. "Would you like to help me with the crust?" Grace asked Oliver, and to Daniel's astonishment, his son nodded eagerly. Days turned into weeks, and the house began to feel different. One morning, Daniel woke to the sound of laughter, a sound so foreign it took him a moment to recognize it. Following the noise, he found himself at the kitchen doorway again, becoming an unknowing witness to a scene that both warmed and unsettled him. Grace stood at the counter with Oliver, both covered in flour, teaching him how to knead bread dough. "Like this?" she demonstrated, her hands working the dough with practiced ease. "It's like giving it a massage. The bread needs love to rise properly." Oliver's small hands mimicked her movements, his face screwed up in concentration. "Like this, Grace?" "Perfect," she encouraged, and Oliver beamed with pride. Daniel watched, unnoticed, feeling like an outsider in his own home. Yet he couldn't deny the change in his son, the light returning to his eyes, the gradual return of his voice, the way he seemed to be emerging from his shell of grief. The kitchen became a dance of near misses and accidental touches. One morning, as Daniel reached for his coffee, Grace turned suddenly, bumping into his chest. Time seemed to freeze as they stood there, her hand steadying herself against his arms, the warmth of the contact sending an unexpected jolt through his system. The subtle scent of vanilla and something uniquely her filled his senses. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Trent," she breathed, stepping back quickly, a flush coloring her cheeks. "Daniel," he found himself saying. "Please, call me Daniel." The moment passed, but its effect lingered. Daniel began finding reasons to linger over breakfast, his coffee growing cold as he watched Grace and Oliver interact. She had a way of drawing his son out, asking questions that required more than one-word answers, showing genuine interest in his thoughts and feelings. One morning, as Oliver enthusiastically described his art project to Grace, Daniel caught himself studying her, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, how she leaned in when Oliver spoke, making him feel truly heard. She glanced up, catching his gaze, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Daniel quickly stood, making his excuses about work, but as he left, he could feel Grace's presence like a warmth at his back. He was beginning to realize that hiring Grace Thompson hadn't just brought life back to his kitchen. She was slowly, unknowingly, beginning to thaw the ice around his heart, and that terrified him more than he cared to admit. As he drove to work that morning, Daniel couldn't shake the image of Grace's smile or the way Oliver's eyes lit up in her presence. For the first time since losing Emily, his carefully constructed walls felt less like protection and more like a prison, but letting them down? That was a risk he wasn't sure he was ready to take. Spring arrived with gentle persistence, much like Grace's presence in the Trent household. One Saturday morning, Daniel stood at his study window, watching as Grace and Oliver knelt in the garden behind the house. They had converted a neglected patch of earth into what would soon become an herb garden, and Daniel couldn't help but notice how natural they looked together. "The basil needs lots of sunlight," Grace was explaining, her hands gently guiding Oliver's as they patted soil around a small plant. "Just like you, it grows stronger when it's warm and loved." Oliver's face lit up with determination. "Can we plant Mom's favorite too, the lavender?" Daniel's breath caught at the mention of Emily. It had been months since Oliver had spoken of her so freely. He watched as Grace paused, her expression softening with understanding. "Of course we can," she replied, pulling out a lavender seedling. "And every time it blooms, we'll think of her." That night, a spring storm rolled in, rattling windows and sending sheets of rain against the glass. Unable to sleep, Daniel wandered to the library, only to find Grace already there. She sat curled in Emily's old reading chair, a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice in her lap, illuminated by the soft glow of a table lamp. "Oh," she startled, beginning to rise. "I'm sorry. I should have asked." "Please," Daniel gestured for her to stay. "The library's meant to be used." Thunder crashed outside, and Grace jumped slightly. Daniel found himself moving closer, drawn by her vulnerability. "Not fond of storms?" She smiled sheepishly. "They used to terrify me as a child. Now I find them atmospheric, perfect for reading Jane Austen." Daniel noticed a collection of cookbooks on the table beside her. As they both reached for one, their hands brushed. The contact was brief but electric, sending warmth spreading through his fingers. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the storm outside faded into background noise. A particularly loud thunderclap broke the spell, followed by the sound of running feet in the hallway. Oliver appeared in the doorway, tears streaming down his face. "Grace!" he cried, running to her. Without hesitation, she opened her arms, enveloping him in a protective embrace. "Shh, it's all right," she soothed, running her fingers through his hair. "Would you like to hear about the time I built a blanket fort during a storm?" Daniel watched from the shadows, his heart constricting. The scene before him was both beautiful and painful. Beautiful in its tenderness, painful in how it reminded him of Emily. Yet something was different. The ache in his chest wasn't just grief anymore. It was longing for something he hadn't allowed himself to want. Days later, Daniel found himself in the kitchen as Grace prepared dinner. She was reaching for a spice jar on the top shelf, stretching on tiptoes but falling just short. Without thinking, he stepped behind her, reaching up to help. The movement brought them close, so close he could feel the warmth of her body, smell the vanilla and rosemary that seemed to follow her everywhere. Grace went still, her breath catching audibly. Daniel's hand closed around the jar, but he didn't move away immediately. Time seemed to slow, charged with unspoken possibilities. When Grace finally turned her head slightly, their faces were inches apart. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel stepped back, his heart racing. "Of course," he managed, retreating to safer ground. The tension between them continued to build, reaching an unexpected crescendo one evening when Grace discovered Emily's old recipe box. Daniel found her studying a handwritten recipe for fettuccine Alfredo, Emily's favorite. "Would you like to learn how to make it?" Grace asked softly, catching his gaze. Daniel's first instinct was to refuse, to protect himself from the memories, but something in Grace's expression, understanding without pity, made him nod. They worked side by side, Grace guiding his hands as they made pasta from scratch. "The secret is in the touch," she explained, her fingers ghosting over his as they kneaded the dough. "You have to feel when it's right." As they cooked, stories of Emily naturally emerged, small memories, happy ones. Grace listened with genuine interest, asking questions that somehow made it easier to share. Later that night, after Oliver was asleep, they sat in the kitchen with cups of chamomile tea. The pasta had been perfect, bringing back memories that, for the first time, didn't feel like daggers to Daniel's heart. "She sounds wonderful," Grace said softly, cradling her cup. "The way you speak of her. She must have filled this house with so much love." Daniel stared into his tea, feeling the walls he'd built beginning to crumble. "She did, and when she died, I didn't know how to keep that love alive. I thought if I just kept moving, kept working." "You were trying to protect yourself," Grace observed gently, "and Oliver." "But I was wrong," Daniel admitted, looking up to meet her eyes. "I was so focused on avoiding pain that I forgot how to live. Until—" He trailed off, but the words hung unspoken between them. "Until you came." Grace reached across the table, hesitantly placing her hand over his. The touch was gentle, understanding, offering comfort without demanding anything in return. Daniel found himself turning his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. Outside, the garden they'd planted together swayed in the spring breeze, lavender and herbs reaching toward the moonlight. Inside, in the quiet of the kitchen that had once again become the heart of the house, something new was taking root, fragile and unexpected, but growing stronger with each passing day. Daniel looked at their joined hands, then at Grace's face, soft in the kitchen's dim light. For the first time since losing Emily, he felt something that wasn't just grief or loneliness. It was hope, tentative and tender, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through winter's frost. Summer had settled over the lakeside estate, bringing with it long, golden evenings and the kind of warmth that seemed to soften everything, including, gradually, Daniel's carefully maintained boundaries. One such evening, he returned home early, following the sound of music drifting from the kitchen. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. Grace was swaying to an old jazz standard, her movements fluid and unself-conscious as she stirred something on the stove. Her hair was loose for once, falling in gentle waves around her shoulders, and she hummed along with Ella Fitzgerald's velvet voice. When she turned, catching sight of him in the doorway, she didn't startle or stop. Instead, their eyes locked, and she offered a smile that made his heart skip. "Join me?" she asked softly, extending her hand. Daniel found himself moving forward before he could think better of it. Their fingers intertwined, and suddenly they were swaying together in the kitchen, the pasta sauce forgotten on the stove. Grace's hand felt small in his, her other resting lightly on his shoulder. The scent of her, vanilla, herbs, and something uniquely Grace enveloped him. "I haven't danced in years," he admitted quietly. "Sometimes," she replied, looking up at him. "We forget things that once brought us joy until someone reminds us." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility, until the timer's sharp ring brought them back to reality. But something had shifted, like a key turning in a long-rusted lock. Days later, Daniel found Grace asleep on the porch swing, a book fallen open in her lap. The evening air was growing cool, and she looked peaceful, vulnerable in her repose. He stood watching her for a moment, struck by how natural she looked there, as if she'd always been part of this home. Moving quietly, he retrieved a soft blanket from inside and carefully draped it over her. As he tucked it around her shoulders, Grace stirred slightly, murmuring something in her sleep. Her hand caught his, holding it loosely, and Daniel found himself frozen, torn between staying and retreating. Finally, gently, he squeezed her hand before pulling away, his fingers tingling from the contact. The next afternoon found them walking by the lake, Oliver running ahead to skip stones across the water. The conversation flowed easily between them, touching on childhood memories. Grace spoke of learning to cook in her grandmother's kitchen, while Daniel shared stories of building tree houses with his brother. "I always wanted a tree house," Grace admitted, stopping to watch the sunset paint the lake in golds and pinks. "Somewhere magical and secret, just for me." "It's not too late," Daniel replied, studying her profile in the fading light. "Dreams don't come with expiration dates." She turned to him then, her eyes bright with something that made his breath catch. "Is that what you believe? About dreams?" Before he could answer, thunder rumbled overhead. The sky had darkened rapidly, threatening rain. "Quick!" Daniel said, taking her hand. "The greenhouse." They ran for shelter just as the heavens opened, making it inside seconds before the downpour began. The greenhouse was warm and humid, filled with the scent of earth and growing things. They stood close together, watching the rain sheet down the glass walls, their breathing slightly quick from the run. "You never answered my question," Grace said softly, turning to face him. They were standing so close he could see droplets of rain clinging to her eyelashes. "About dreams?" Daniel moved slightly closer, drawn by some force he couldn't, or wouldn't, resist. "I'm beginning to believe in them again." The next morning brought another intimate moment in the kitchen. Grace was baking, flour dusting her cheeks and hair, when Daniel entered. Without thinking, he reached out, gently wiping a smudge of flour from her cheek. His hand lingered, cupping her face, and Grace leaned almost imperceptibly into his touch. Their faces drew closer, breaths mingling. Daniel could feel his heart pounding, could see the slight parting of Grace's lips. Just before their lips met, Oliver's voice rang out from the hallway, breaking the spell. They jumped apart, but the tension remained, electric and undeniable. A week later, Grace and Oliver conspired together, planning a surprise birthday dinner for Daniel. He returned home to find the dining room transformed, candles flickering, the table set beautifully, and all his favorite foods prepared with care. Oliver proudly presented a handmade card, while Grace stood back, watching with shining eyes. "Make a wish, Dad," Oliver said, as Daniel prepared to blow out the candles. Daniel looked at his son's happy face, then at Grace, standing in the soft candlelight. For the first time in 2 years, he knew exactly what to wish for. The evening ended with them all by the lake, the air warm and heavy with the promise of rain. Oliver had gone inside, leaving Daniel and Grace alone on the dock. When the first drops fell, neither moved to seek shelter. "We should go in," Grace said, but made no move to leave. "Should we?" Daniel turned to face her, rain beginning to soak through his shirt. "No," she whispered, and this time when he reached for her, there was no interruption. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, then deepened with the intensity of long-held desire finally released. The rain fell around them, but neither noticed, lost in the moment they'd been moving toward since that first day in his study. Daniel's hands cradled her face, while Grace's fingers gripped his shirt, pulling him closer. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Grace smiled up at him through the rain. "I've been waiting for you to do that," she admitted. "I've been waiting too," Daniel replied, touching his forehead to hers. "I just didn't know it until now." They stood there in the rain, holding each other, as the lake lapped gently at the dock and the evening wrapped around them like a blanket. In that moment, Daniel realized that love wasn't about replacing what was lost, but about opening your heart to new possibilities, new dreams, new beginnings. And there, by the lake where he'd spent countless evenings lost in grief, Daniel found himself embracing joy again, with Grace in his arms and the future stretching out before them, full of promise and possibility. The morning after their rain-soaked kiss, Grace found the letter waiting among the day's mail. Her father's familiar, jagged handwriting made her hands tremble as she opened it. The contents, demands for money, threats of exposure, reminders of old debts, hit her like physical blows. She sank into a kitchen chair, the paper crumpling in her grip. The perfect bubble of happiness she'd been living in suddenly felt fragile, temporary. Her past, which she'd tried so hard to leave behind, had finally caught up with her. The weight of her secrets pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. When Daniel entered the kitchen that morning, he immediately sensed the change. Grace's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and her usual warmth seemed dimmed. She moved through her tasks mechanically, her mind clearly elsewhere. "Grace?" He touched her shoulder gently. "Is everything all right?" "Of course," she replied too quickly, stepping away from his touch. "Just tired, I suppose." But Daniel had learned to read her better than that. That evening, after Oliver was asleep, he prepared her favorite tea, chamomile with honey, just as she'd taught him. He found her in the library, staring unseeing at a book in her lap. "I thought you might like this," he said softly, offering the cup. Grace looked up, surprise and emotion flickering across her face. "You remembered how I like it?" "You've taught me well." He sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort but giving her space. "Something's troubling you." She cradled the cup, drawing comfort from its warmth. Sometimes the past doesn't stay where we leave it." Before Daniel could respond, they heard Oliver's voice from the doorway. "Look what I found!" He held a dusty photo album, and Grace's heart clenched as she recognized it. Emily's album. Daniel went still beside her. Oliver climbed between them on the sofa, opening the album across their laps. "That's Mom," he said proudly, pointing to a photo of Emily in the garden, her face bright with laughter. "She loved flowers, just like you, Grace." Grace started to stand, feeling like an intruder in this intimate family moment, but Daniel's hand found hers, holding her in place. "Stay," he whispered. "Please." Together, they looked through the album, Oliver sharing memories of his mother, while Daniel added quiet details. Grace listened, her heart aching with love for them both and fear of what she might lose. Later that night, after Oliver was asleep, Grace stood in the darkened kitchen, the letter from her father spread before her. The solution seemed clear. She had to leave. Better to go now, before she became even more entangled, before her past could hurt the two people she'd grown to love more than she'd thought possible. She didn't hear Daniel enter until he spoke. "I thought I might find you here." Turning, Grace tried to hide her tears, but it was too late. Daniel crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, gathering her into his arms. She resisted for a moment before collapsing against his chest, letting out a sob she'd been holding back all day. "Talk to me," he murmured into her hair. "Whatever it is, we can face it together." Grace pulled back slightly, looking up at him through tear-blurred eyes. "Can we? There are things about me, about my past." "We all have pasts, Grace." His hands framed her face, thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Mine is all over this house, in every room, every memory. You've never asked me to forget that, only to make room for new memories alongside the old ones." "This is different," she whispered. "My father. I owe him money. Money I don't have. He's threatening to expose things about my past, about mistakes I've made. I can't let that touch you and Oliver." Daniel's expression softened. "Is that why you've been pulling away? Because you think we need protecting? You've been through so much already. Oliver's been through so much. I should just go." The force of his response surprised them both. "Running isn't the answer, not when we've finally found our way to each other." Grace shook her head, fresh tears falling. "I'm not who you think I am. I've made mistakes. Haven't we all?" Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. "The Grace I know, the one who brought light back into this house, who taught my son to laugh again, who showed me that life goes on after loss. That's the real Grace. Whatever happened in your past, it led you here, to us. I'm grateful for that, even for the mistakes that brought you to our door." Before Grace could respond, they heard small footsteps. Oliver stood in the doorway, clutching a piece of paper. "I made this," he said, holding it out to Grace with solemn determination. Grace took the drawing with trembling hands. It showed 3 figures, Daniel, Oliver, and herself, standing in front of the house. Above them, in careful child's writing, were the words, "My family." "Please don't go," Oliver said quietly. "We need you." Grace looked from the drawing to Oliver's earnest face, then to Daniel's steady gaze. All her carefully constructed arguments for leaving crumbled in the face of this simple truth. They had become a family, not through blood or obligation, but through love and choice. Daniel pulled them both into his embrace, Oliver between them, and Grace felt something settle in her heart. Whatever came, they would face it together. Her father's threats suddenly seemed less powerful in the face of this love they'd built. "I'll tell you everything," she promised softly. "About my past, about father." "Tomorrow," Daniel said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Right now, just stay here with us." Oliver yawned, snuggling closer. "Can we have hot chocolate?" Grace laughed through her tears, the sound warming the kitchen. "With extra marshmallows?" "Always with extra marshmallows," Daniel agreed. And for that moment, in the quiet of their midnight kitchen, everything else faded away. They were just a family, holding each other close, finding strength in their togetherness. The drawing lay on the counter, a testament to the simple wisdom of a child's heart. Family isn't about perfect pasts or unblemished histories. It's about choosing to love, choosing to stay, choosing to face whatever comes together. The next morning, Grace told them everything. Her father's gambling debts that she'd inherited, the desperate choices she'd made to keep them both afloat, the string of jobs she'd left when he inevitably found her. As she spoke, Daniel held her hand across the kitchen table, his thumb tracing soothing circles on her palm. When she finished, silence filled the kitchen. Grace held her breath, waiting for the judgment she'd faced so many times before. Instead, Daniel stood, walked around the table, and knelt beside her chair. "Thank you," he said softly, "for trusting us with your truth." Rain began to fall outside, a gentle summer shower that painted the windows with streaming rivulets. Daniel glanced out, then back to Grace, a decisive look crossing his face. "Come with me." He led her out onto the back porch, then down the steps into the rain. Grace followed, puzzled but trusting. When they reached the center of the garden, He turned to face her, rain soaking through his shirt. 2 years ago, he began, his voice carrying over the sound of falling rain, I thought I'd never feel love again. I built walls around my heart, convinced that protecting myself from pain meant I was protecting Oliver too. But then you came, with your warmth and your cooking and your ability to see beauty in broken things. Grace's heart thundered in her chest as Daniel took both her hands in his. You didn't just bring life back to this house, he continued, rain running down his face. You showed me that love isn't something you run out of, that there's always room for more, if you're brave enough to let it in. Daniel, Grace whispered, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. I love you, he declared, his voice strong and sure. Not despite your past, but including it, because every step you took, every choice you made, led you here to us. And I'm thankful for that journey, even the painful parts, because it brought you home. Grace launched herself into his arms, and their lips met in a kiss that tasted of rain and tears and joy. When they parted, both breathless, Daniel pressed his forehead to hers. Let me help you with your father, he murmured. Let me share your burdens the way you've shared ours. Grace nodded, unable to speak through her emotions. From the porch, they heard a whoop of joy and turned to see Oliver watching them, beaming. Finally, he called out, running to join them in the rain. Weeks passed, and summer deepened into a golden August. The herb garden Grace and Oliver had planted flourished, filling the air with fragrant promises. One evening, as the three of them prepared dinner together, Grace realized she'd never felt more at peace. Oliver stood on a step stool, carefully measuring ingredients for their favorite pasta sauce. Daniel moved around the kitchen with newfound confidence, chopping vegetables while Grace kneaded bread dough. Their movements had become a dance, comfortable and synchronized. Remember when Dad couldn't even boil water? Oliver teased, making Grace laugh. I wasn't that bad, Daniel protested, but his eyes twinkled. You kind of were, Grace said, reaching up to kiss his cheek, leaving a flower print behind. Later that week, Daniel asked Grace to help him check on the herb garden before dinner. As they walked hand in hand between the fragrant rows, Grace noticed something different. Tucked among the lavender was a small wooden box. What's this? She asked, bending to pick it up. Open it, Daniel said softly. Inside, nestled on a bed of fresh herbs, was a ring, simple, elegant, with a single diamond that caught the evening light. Grace looked up to find Daniel on one knee beside her. This garden, he said, gesturing around them, was the first thing you and Oliver created together. It was the beginning of our healing, of becoming a family. I can't think of a better place to ask you to make that family official. Grace's vision blurred with tears as Daniel took the ring from the box. Grace Thompson, will you marry us? Will you continue creating memories, growing love, and making this house a home? Will you be my wife and Oliver's mother? Yes, Grace whispered, then louder. Yes. As Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, Oliver burst from his hiding place behind the greenhouse, throwing himself into their embrace. They held each other, laughing and crying, surrounded by the herbs they'd planted together. 2 months later, they married by the lake at sunset. Oliver stood proudly as best man, holding their rings on a small pillow he'd insisted on making himself. Grace wore a simple white dress and carried a bouquet of herbs and wildflowers from their garden. Daniel couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him through the golden light. Their vows were simple, honest, filled with promises of love and understanding. When Daniel kissed his bride, the small gathering of friends cheered, and Oliver hugged them both, completing their circle. The reception was intimate, featuring all their favorite recipes, including Emily's fettuccine alfredo, now infused with new memories alongside the old. They danced under strings of lights, shared stories and laughter, and celebrated not just their marriage, but the healing power of love. One morning, several weeks later, the kitchen was filled with early autumn sunlight as they prepared breakfast together. Oliver sat at the counter, carefully drawing in his sketchbook, while Grace wrote in the recipe book Daniel had given her, the one that had started empty, waiting to be filled with their family's stories. Daniel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you writing?" Grace smiled, leaning back against him. "The recipe for happiness?" she said, showing him the page where she'd written their pancake recipe, accompanied by notes about Oliver's favorite toppings and the morning Daniel had finally mastered the perfect flip. "And what's the secret ingredient?" Daniel asked, pressing a kiss to her neck. "Love," Oliver answered from his spot at the counter, not looking up from his drawing. "Obviously." Grace and Daniel laughed, the sound filling the kitchen with warmth. Through the window, they could see their herb garden, still blooming despite the approaching fall. The lake sparkled in the distance, and the house that had once felt so empty now pulsed with life and love. Grace turned in Daniel's arms, reaching up to touch his face. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For giving me a home. For letting me be part of your story." Daniel kissed her softly. "Thank you for showing us that every story can have a new chapter." Oliver made a gagging sound from the counter, but he was smiling. Grace turned back to her recipe book, Daniel's arms still around her, and continued writing. On the page, next to the pancake recipe, she added, "Home is where love grows, where memories are made, and where broken hearts learn to beat again, together." Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the herbs, carrying the scent of lavender and new beginnings through their kitchen window. Inside, a family, built on choice and love and healing, continued writing their story, one recipe at a time.